When Jackson Miller's rusted tractor blade caught on a forgotten wooden crate buried in the damp soil of his North Carolina tobacco field, he never imagined that within hours history professors would be camped on his front porch, or that his casual cleanup of an old barn would uncover Civil War correspondence so explosive it would rewrite textbooks and place his struggling family farm at the center of a historical revelation that would shake the foundations of his community's understanding of the past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The March rain pelted Jackson Miller's weathered John Deere cap as he surveyed the collapsed eastern wall of the old tobacco barn. At 48, the deepening lines around his eyes told the story of 3 generations of Millers who had worked this land. Years of pre-dawn risings, drought-stricken summers, and the constant battle to keep a family farm afloat in an era of corporate agriculture. The storm last night had finally claimed the decaying structure his grandfather had built in 1933, and now the cleanup would set him back at least 2 days from spring planting. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us," he called to his 19-year-old son Ethan, who was already dragging splintered boards toward their pickup. The boy, Jackson still thought of him as a boy despite his 6'2" frame and college sophomore status, had driven down from UNC Charlotte for the weekend to help, his agriculture studies giving him a spring break that aligned perfectly with planting season. "Dad, some of these support beams are still good," Ethan called, his practical farm upbringing evident in his assessment. "No sense wasting hardwood that seasoned." Jackson nodded with approval. The Miller farm had survived for nearly 120 years by wasting nothing and working harder than the next man. The 175-acre property, nestled in the rolling hills of Rockwell County with its rich soil and reliable creek, had once been among the most productive tobacco farms in the region. Now, with tobacco's decline, they'd diversified into soybeans, sweet potatoes, and a small but growing organic vegetable operation that supplied 3 farm-to-table restaurants in Charlotte. The rain intensified as they worked, forcing them to focus on salvaging what they could before everything became too waterlogged. Jackson maneuvered the tractor to help shift some of the heavier collapsed sections, the aged machine protesting. With each movement but still functioning, despite its 30 years of service. His grandfather had taught him that proper maintenance meant equipment should outlast the man who bought it. As the tractor's front blade scraped against the sodden earth where the barn's floor had partially collapsed, a metallic clang rang out. Jackson immediately cut the engine, climbing down to investigate. Years of farming had taught him to identify potential equipment damage by sound alone. "Hit something?" Ethan asked, joining his father at the depression where decades of barn floor had protected whatever lay beneath. "Feels solid," Jackson replied, already on his knees in the mud, clearing debris with his gloved hands. "Probably an old piece of equipment your great-granddad forgot about." Instead, their hands revealed the rusted metal clasps of a wooden grate, about 3 feet long and 18 inches wide, buried several inches below the barn's original flooring. The wood had rotted along one edge, but remained surprisingly intact, preserved by its burial and the protection of the structure above. "This was deliberately hidden," Jackson observed, noting how the floorboards above it had once been cut and replaced to conceal the cache. "Help me get it out of this mud before the hole fills with water." Together, they worked the crate free, its surprising weight suggesting contents that had remained protected from the elements. They carried it to the equipment shed, where a makeshift workbench offered shelter from the rain. As Ethan gathered tools to pry open the rusted clasps, Jackson studied the craftsmanship of the box itself. Dovetailed corners and hardwood construction that spoke of an era when things were built to last. "Look at this," he said, pointing to faded markings on the lid, partially visible beneath decades of grime. Carefully wiping away the accumulated dirt revealed the stenciled letters, CSA QM Core, Charlotte Div. Ethan's eyes widened. CSA, Confederate States Army, Quartermaster Corps? Jackson nodded slowly. His grandfather's stories of their land's history flickered through his memory. Tales he had assumed were partially fabricated to entertain a young boy during long summer evenings on the porch. "Your great-great-grandfather settled this land after the Civil War," he recounted. "Granddad used to claim there had been soldiers through here, but I always figured he was embellishing." The rusted clasps finally surrendered to their tools with a reluctant groan. Father and son exchanged a glance of anticipation before Jackson carefully lifted the lid, releasing the musty scent of paper and leather long sealed away from the world. Inside, protected by an oilcloth that had done its job remarkably well, lay several leather-bound journals, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a collection of official-looking documents bearing the seal of the Confederate government. Beneath these, wrapped separately, was a tarnished brass officer's field telescope and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of the surrounding countryside. "Oh my God," Ethan whispered, his history minor suddenly very relevant. "Dad, these look like field dispatches and personal correspondence from during the war." Jackson carefully lifted one of the journals, its leather binding still supple. Opening to a random page, he read aloud, "April 17th, 1865. News of Lee's surrender reached us today, though many refuse to accept it as truth. Collier Harrison insists. Our position here remains strategically vital to the protection of the supply routes, regardless of events in Virginia. We are to maintain the defensive works and continue preparations as if the war continues unabated." The locals remain divided in their sympathies, but have thus far kept our presence here a closely guarded secret. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ethan had already begun examining one of the maps. "Dad, this is our land. Look, here's the creek bend and the ridge line. These markings, I think they're showing defensive positions, artillery placements." Jackson compared the aged document to his intimate knowledge of his property. Despite 150 years of changes, the essential geography remained recognizable. The creek that bordered the western edge of their farm, the natural rise that formed a perfect vantage point overlooking the valley below. "This can't be right," he said, tracing the markings with a weathered finger. "There were never any battles fought here. Every school kid in the county knows the war barely touched this area." "Maybe there's a reason it never made it into the history books," Ethan suggested, already examining another document from the crate. This one appeared to be an official order on Confederate War Department letterhead, the elegant script faded but still legible. As they continued to carefully examine the contents, the rain intensified outside, drumming on the metal roof of the equipment shed. Neither noticed the passing hours as they became increasingly absorbed in the story unfolding before them. A story of a hidden Confederate defensive position established in the war's final months, of a desperate plan to establish a fallback stronghold should Richmond fall, and of the complicated loyalties of the local populations caught between opposing forces. By nightfall, they had only explored a fraction of the crate's contents, but even this initial examination suggested something extraordinary. Their family farm, passed down through generations of millers, had once been the site of a significant Confederate installation that somehow had been erased from official histories. We need to show these to someone who can verify their authenticity, Ethan said, as they carefully repacked the materials, bringing the crate into the farmhouse kitchen, where it sat incongruously beside their modern coffee maker. Dr. Abernathy in my history department specializes in Civil War studies. Jackson nodded, his practical farmer's mind already calculating the implications. Take photos of a few pages, but let's keep this quiet until we know what we're dealing. With something this significant, there's going to be a lot of people interested once word gets out. That night, after Ethan had sent carefully selected images to his professor with a request for discretion, Jackson sat alone at the kitchen table, examining one leather journal by lamplight. Unlike the official dispatches, this appeared to be the personal diary of a Lieutenant Thomas Wilkes, whose elegant handwriting recorded not just military movements, but observations about the land itself. The same land Jackson had farmed his entire life. The high ground by the creek fork offers commanding views of the approach road, Wilkes had written in an entry dated March 1865. Miller's farmstead provides excellent cover for our forward scouts, though the family's loyalty remains suspect, despite their provision of supplies. The lady of the house, in particular, seems to watch our movements with an attention that suggests more than casual interest. Jackson's hand froze on the page. Miller's farmstead. The name couldn't be coincidence. According to family law, the first Miller had acquired this land in 1868, after the war's end. But this diary suggested Millers had been here during the conflict itself, and perhaps with complicated allegiances. He turned pages quickly, searching for more mentions of his possible ancestors. Another entry caught his eye. Young Samuel Miller continues to provide valuable intelligence regarding Union sympathizers in the region, though I question whether his parents are aware of the boy's activities. He seems remarkably well informed about movements along the western roads. Samuel Miller. The name resonated through generations. Jackson's grandfather had been Samuel Miller IV, named in an unbroken line that stretched back to someone who apparently had been involved in Confederate intelligence operations as little more than a child. Sleep eluded Jackson that night as questions multiplied in his mind. His family's carefully maintained history, hard-working farmers who had acquired their land through honest labor after the war, seemed increasingly built on omissions, if not outright fabrications. Why had this history been buried, quite literally, beneath the floorboards of his grandfather's barn? And what would it mean for the Miller legacy if their claim to the land was somehow entangled with Confederate military operations that had been deliberately erased from official records? As dawn broke across the eastern fields, painting the wet spring soil with golden light, Jackson's phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Dr. Abernathy responded, "Says documents appear authentic, wants to see everything ASAP, says this could be historically significant." Jackson stared out at the land his family had worked for generations, land that now seemed to hold secrets he had never suspected. Historically significant, he muttered to himself. That's one way of putting it. He was about to respond to Ethan when the distinctive sound of tires on wet gravel caught his attention. Visitors at 6:15 a.m. were unusual enough to warrant investigation, particularly given their discovery. Moving to the front window, Jackson watched as two vehicles, a black SUV and a silver sedan, pulled into his circular driveway. From the sedan emerged a woman in her mid-50s, professionally dressed, despite the early hour, carrying a leather portfolio. From the SUV stepped a younger man, who immediately began surveying the property with the attentive gaze of someone accustomed to assessing new environments. Both approached the house with purpose, suggesting this was far from a casual visit. Rather than waiting for them to knock, Jackson opened the door, the farmer's traditional hospitality overriding his growing wariness. "Morning," he greeted them, standing firmly in the doorway. "You folks are out awfully early." "Mr. Miller?" the woman inquired, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Hargrove, Director of Historical Preservation for the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. This is my colleague, Mr. James Fitzroy, from the University Historical Society." Jackson studied them carefully, noting how Fitzroy continued to scan the property as if looking for something specific. "What brings the State Historical Office to my farm at dawn?" Dr. Hargrove smiled slightly. "Your son contacted Dr. Abernathy at UNC Charlotte about some historical documents discovered on your property. Dr. Abernathy is an old colleague and immediately recognized their potential significance. We happened to be in the region for another matter and thought it prudent to see these materials first-hand as quickly as possible." The explanation was reasonable, but didn't quite account for their urgency or early arrival. Jackson had spent enough years negotiating with tobacco companies and agricultural corporations to recognize when someone wasn't sharing their full motivation. "My son sent a few photographs last night," he said evenly. "Seems like an awfully quick response from the State Department." "May we come in, Mr. Miller?" Dr. Hargrove asked, sidestepping his observation. "What you've discovered could potentially be of considerable historical importance." Jackson hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. Whatever was happening, it seemed better to learn more about their interest than to turn them away. "Coffee's fresh," he offered, leading them to the kitchen where the wooden crate still sat on the table, its contents now neatly arranged beside it. Fitzroy's eyes locked immediately on the materials, his casual demeanor shifting to intense focus. "These appear to be in remarkable condition," he noted, approaching but not touching the documents. "Original Confederate War Department dispatches are exceptionally rare, particularly field communications from the final months of the conflict." Jackson poured coffee for his unexpected guests, watching as Dr. Hargrove carefully examined one of the maps with evident excitement. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, almost to herself. "These fortification plans match several unexplained topographical anomalies we've identified through LiDAR scanning of this region." "LiDAR scanning?" Jackson questioned. "You've been surveying my land?" Dr. Hargrove looked up, seeming to recalibrate her approach. "The state conducts regular archaeological and historical surveys using aerial mapping technologies. These are non-invasive and cover-wide regions, not targeting specific properties." She paused, then continued more deliberately. "Mr. Miller, are you aware of any unusual features on your land? unexplained depressions, mounds, or areas where crops grow differently. The question struck Jackson as oddly specific. There's a section along the western ridge where the soil's always been different, harder to work, drains poorly. My grandfather called it the dead zone. Nothing would grow right there, so we've used it for equipment storage mostly. Fitzroy and Hargrove exchanged a meaningful glance. "Would you be willing to show us this area?" Fitzroy asked, his casual tone belied by the intensity in his eyes. Something about their focused interest made Jackson increasingly cautious. "Mind telling me why the State Historical Office is so interested in my family's farm? These documents are interesting, sure, but they're hardly national treasures." Dr. Hargrove set down her coffee cup and regarded Jackson directly. "Mr. Miller, based on what your son shared with Dr. Abernathy, we believe your property may contain the remains of a previously undocumented Confederate defensive installation from the final months of the Civil War. Specifically, an artillery position established as part of the last-ditch Carolinas campaign." "That much I gathered from the journals," Jackson acknowledged. "But that doesn't explain LiDAR surveys or why you're at my door at dawn." Fitzroy spoke up, his voice measured. "The historical record indicates there were no significant Confederate defensive positions in this region. Official Union Army records make no mention of encountering resistance here, and post-war accounts categorically state that no military actions occurred in Rockwell County. Yet, these documents suggest otherwise," Jackson concluded. "Precisely," Dr. Hargrove confirmed, "which means either these documents are elaborate forgeries, which preliminary analysis suggests they are not, or the historical record was deliberately altered to omit whatever occurred here in early 1865. The implications hung in the air between them." Jackson thought again of the journal entries mentioning his ancestors, the Miller family providing intelligence to Confederate forces, their loyalties described as suspect. "There's something else," he said finally, reaching for the lieutenant's journal he'd been reading overnight. "These personal accounts mention my family. Millers living on this land during the war, apparently with complicated allegiances. Family history always said the first Miller bought this land in 1868, after returning from the war." Dr. Hargrove accepted the journal, reading the indicated passages with growing interest. "Family histories often contain strategic omissions," she noted diplomatically, "particularly regarding the Civil War period, when many families found themselves with divided loyalties or took actions they later preferred not to memorialize." "You think my family was involved in something they wanted forgotten?" Jackson stated flatly. "I think," Dr. Hargrove replied carefully, "that these documents suggest your ancestors were caught in the complicated final months of a devastating war, possibly made difficult choices, and then, like many Americans, preferred to look forward rather than backward once peace was established." Fitzroy, who had been examining the maps intently, looked up. "Mr. Miller, these fortification plans indicate significant defensive works along what you'd call your western ridge. If those earthworks still exist in any form, even buried or eroded, they represent an invaluable historical resource." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, more visitors arriving. Through the kitchen window, Jackson watched as two additional vehicles pulled in, a university-marked SUV and a larger commercial truck with equipment visible in its bed. "More colleagues?" he asked, an edge creeping into his voice. Dr. Hargrove at least had the grace to look slightly apologetic. When historical discoveries of this potential magnitude emerge, word travels quickly in professional circles. It appears Dr. Abernathy has arrived with some university resources. And the equipment truck? Jackson pressed. Ground-penetrating radar, Fitzroy admitted. Standard archaeological assessment tools. Jackson set his coffee cup down firmly. Let me be clear. Nobody's scanning, digging, or otherwise investigating my property without proper permissions and paperwork. I've got spring planting to finish, and a farm to run. Of course, Doctor. Hargrove agreed smoothly. Any formal investigation would require your consent and appropriate permits. However, given the potential historical significance, we're prepared to offer compensation for any disruption to your agricultural operations. The mention of compensation caught Jackson's attention despite his wariness. The Miller farm, like most family operations, operated on razor-thin margins. The organic program was promising, but required upfront investment they were still struggling to finance. What kind of compensation? He asked, the practical farmer asserting itself over historical curiosities. That would depend on what we find, Dr. Hargrove explained. If these documents prove accurate and significant historical artifacts or structures remain on your property, there are various grants, tax incentives, and potential tourism opportunities that could provide substantial financial benefits. Many landowners find that historical resources can generate more sustainable income than traditional agriculture, particularly for struggling family farms. The assessment struck uncomfortably close to Jackson's private concerns about the farm's future. With Ethan showing more interest in agricultural science than hands-on farming, he had been quietly wondering if the Miller agricultural legacy might end with his generation. Before he could respond, the kitchen door opened and Ethan entered, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who could only be Dr. Abernathy. The professor's eyes lit up at the sight of the documents spread across the kitchen table. "Mr. Miller," he breathed, already moving toward the materials with the reverence of someone approaching a religious artifact. "Your son's discovery may well be the most significant Civil War find in this region in 50 years. These documents appear to confirm persistent rumors of a ghost battery that supposedly defended the western approach to Charlotte in the war's final weeks." "Ghost battery," Jackson repeated. "A Confederate artillery position that appears in no official records but has persisted in local folklore," Dr. Abernathy explained, carefully examining one of the maps. "According to stories passed down through generations, a small force remained here, even after news of Lee's surrender, committed to a last stand that never materialized because Union forces never came this way." Ethan had moved to stand beside his father, excitement evident in his expression. "Dad, they've brought ground-penetrating radar. We could see what's actually under the dead zone without disturbing anything." Jackson studied his son's face, recognizing the intellectual curiosity that had always distinguished Ethan from the more practically minded Miller men. Then he looked around his kitchen, now crowded with academics and government officials, who had descended on his quiet farm within hours of Ethan's innocent inquiry. "One step at a time," he said firmly. "Before any equipment comes onto my property, I want to understand exactly what these documents contain and what you all believe might be hidden on my land." Dr. Hargrove nodded in agreement. "That's entirely reasonable, Mr. Miller. Perhaps we could start by thoroughly reviewing the materials together, with Dr. Abernathy's expertise to provide historical context." For the next several hours, Jackson's kitchen table became an impromptu historical research center. Additional experts arrived: an archivist specializing in Civil War documents, a military historian from the State University, and a specialist in historical cartography who examined the maps with increasing excitement. What emerged from their collective analysis was a narrative that diverged dramatically from the official history of the region. According to the documents, in early 1865, as Sherman's forces moved north through the Carolinas and Grant pressed Lee in Virginia, Confederate leadership had established a series of fallback defensive positions to protect critical supply routes and potential retreat corridors. The installation on what was now Miller land, designated Position Sparrow in the documents, had been established with artillery capable of controlling the main western approach to Charlotte. More significantly, the dispatches revealed that a cache of Confederate gold intended to finance continuing resistance had been moved through the area in late March 1865, with some correspondence suggesting it might have been temporarily held at the position. Confederate gold? Jackson questioned skeptically. That sounds more like treasure hunting than historical research. Dr. Abernathy shook his head. The lost Confederate treasury has been the subject of speculation for generations, but these documents provide the first credible contemporary account of its movement through this region. While finding any remaining gold would be remarkable, the historical value of confirming these troop movements and installations is the real treasure for scholars. Jackson listened as they continued analyzing the documents, but his attention kept returning to the personal. Journal entries mentioning his ancestors. During a momentary lull, he raised the question that had been troubling him since his late-night reading. The Miller family is mentioned repeatedly in Lieutenant Wilkes's journal, he said, addressing the group. It suggests my ancestors were already on this land during the war, possibly providing intelligence to Confederate forces. But our family history has always been that the first Miller acquired this property after returning from the war in 1868. The room fell uncomfortably quiet. Finally, Dr. Hargrove spoke. Mr. Miller, it was not uncommon for families to revise their histories after the war, particularly in border states and regions with divided loyalties. Many found it easier to create new narratives than to explain complicated choices made during the conflict. You're suggesting my family lied about how they got this land? Jackson stated flatly. I'm suggesting, she replied carefully, that the full story may be more nuanced than what was passed down through generations. These documents indicate your ancestors were already farming here when Confederate forces established Position Sparrow, and Lieutenant Wilkes's observations suggest they had a complex relationship with those forces. Dr. Abernathy, who had been examining additional journal entries, looked up with interest. According to Wilkes, young Samuel Miller was providing information about Union sympathizers in the area. But there's another entry here from April that complicates matters. He read aloud, Miller's eldest son has not returned from his scouting mission. The father grows increasingly agitated, challenging Colin Harrison directly regarding the wisdom of sending a boy of 16 behind enemy lines. His outburst has raised new questions about where the family's true sympathies lie. Jackson processed this information slowly. So my ancestor wasn't just cooperating with Confederate forces. His son was actively working for them and then went missing. And that apparently caused a rift between the father and the Confederate officers, Dr. Abernathy noted. The next entries suggest increasing tension at the position, with Miller Sr. being placed under a form of house arrest due to seditious utterances. As the afternoon progressed, more vehicles arrived. Word of the discovery had evidently spread through academic circles with remarkable speed. Jackson watched from his porch as what had begun as a simple cleanup of a storm-damaged barn transformed into something resembling an archaeological expedition, with equipment being unloaded and earnest discussions occurring among clusters of scholars and preservation specialists. Ethan joined him, excitement still evident in his expression. They're setting up the ground-penetrating radar now. Dr. Abernathy thinks the dead zone might actually be the remains of an artillery emplacement, the disturbed soil structure. Who could explain why nothing grows right there? Jackson nodded absently, his thoughts still on the revelations about his family. Did you see the journal entries about our ancestors? About Samuel Miller working for Confederate intelligence? Ethan confirmed. It's incredible to think our family was directly involved, though it sounds like they might have had second thoughts when his son went missing. Our whole family history might be built on a convenient fiction, Jackson observed. Makes me wonder what else we don't know about our own land. Dr. Hargrove approached, tablet in hand. Mr. Miller, we've completed preliminary analysis of the documents and believe we have sufficient evidence to warrant a non-invasive survey of your property. With your permission, we'd like to begin with the area you identified as the dead zone. Jackson hesitated, still uncomfortable with how quickly events were moving. Yet his farmer's curiosity about the land he'd worked his entire life, particularly the troublesome section that had resisted all agricultural efforts, pushed him toward agreement. You can survey the western section, he conceded. But no digging or disturbance without further discussion. As the afternoon sun slanted across the spring fields, Jackson stood with Ethan watching the methodical movement of the ground-penetrating radar equipment across the area his family had written off as unusable for generations. The technical team worked with careful precision, establishing grid patterns and meticulously documenting their findings. We're getting clear subsurface anomalies, reported the lead technician, showing Dr. Hargrove the initial readings. Consistent, with man-made structures approximately 4 to 6 feet below current grade. Dr. Abernathy, who had joined them at the site, could barely contain his excitement. This matches the fortification designs in the documents perfectly. What you're seeing are likely the buried remains of artillery emplacements and perhaps a bunker or command post. The activity around the dead zone intensified as afternoon stretched into evening. Jackson watched from the edge of the field as researchers meticulously mapped a grid across the troublesome section of land, their excitement growing with each pass of the ground-penetrating radar equipment. The technical team had set up portable floodlights as darkness fell, the unexpected discovery clearly deemed important enough to continue work through the night. "Dad, you need to see this," Ethan called, waving him over to where Dr. Hargrove and the technical team were studying a laptop display. The screen showed what looked like architectural imaging, distinct geometric shapes beneath the surface that were unmistakably man-made. "What exactly am I looking at?" Jackson asked, squinting at the grayscale images. Dr. Hargrove pointed to specific features on the screen. These linear structures are consistent with reinforced earthworks, defensive positions built to protect artillery emplacements. And this larger rectangular area suggests some sort of underground chamber or bunker, approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, with what appears to be an entrance tunnel extending to the south. "A bunker?" Jackson repeated, incredulous. "On my property?" Confederate forces constructed numerous underground command facilities, particularly in the later stages of the war, Dr. Abernathy explained, joining their huddle around the screen. As Union artillery became more effective, protection of command staff and communications became crucial. This appears to be a remarkably sophisticated example. The technical specialist adjusted the display settings, enhancing the contrast, to reveal more details. Based on these readings, the structure is approximately 6 feet below current grade, with evidence of timber reinforcement that has partially collapsed, but largely maintained structural integrity. Jackson stared at the ghostly outlines of what had apparently lain beneath his farm for over 150 years. Military infrastructure his family had never acknowledged, despite generations working the land directly above it. The implications were staggering. "And you believe this was built in early 1865? He asked, trying to fit this new information into his understanding of his family's history. Based on the documents in the crate, this was constructed as part of Position Sparrow in February and March of 1865, Dr. Abernathy confirmed. Lieutenant Wilkes's journal specifically mentions the construction of a secure command facility with protected approaches designed to withstand artillery bombardment. Fitzroy, who had been overseeing the technical team, approached with renewed purpose. "Mr. Miller, given what we've discovered, I'd like to request permission for a preliminary archaeological assessment. This would involve careful excavation of a test trench to determine the condition of the structure and any potential historical artifacts it might contain." Before Jackson could respond, another technician called urgently from the far side of the survey area. "Dr. Hargrove, we've got another significant anomaly approximately 30 yards west of the main structure." The group moved quickly to the new location, where the technician displayed a different set of radar images. "This is unusual. It doesn't match the military construction pattern. It's a smaller chamber, roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter, with what appears to be a narrow access shaft." Dr. Abernathy studied the images with growing excitement. This could be what they called a secure repository in the documentation, a separate facility for storing crucial supplies or documents intentionally positioned away from the main command center in case of direct attack. "Or valuables," Fitzroy added meaningfully, "like a portion of the Confederate treasury mentioned in the dispatches." Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The discovery had rapidly evolved from historical curiosity to something that might have significant legal and financial implications. If there were indeed Confederate artifacts, or worse, gold, buried on his property, the situation would become considerably more complicated. "Nobody's digging anything tonight," he stated firmly. "It's getting late, and I need time to process all this and consider the legal implications before we go further." Dr. Hargrove nodded respectfully. "That's entirely reasonable, Mr. Miller. What we've discovered today is significant enough to warrant careful consideration of next steps. Perhaps we could resume discussions in the morning after you've had time to reflect." Jackson agreed, though he suspected sleep would prove elusive with such extraordinary revelations whirling through his mind. As the various experts began securing their equipment for the night, Ethan approached his father with barely contained excitement. "Dad, this is incredible," he said quietly. Our farm could be a nationally significant historical site. Dr. Abernathy mentioned potential National Register designation if the structures are as intact as the radar suggests. And what would that mean for a working farm? Jackson countered, the practical farmer reasserting itself. We've got planting to finish, crops to manage. Historical designations come with restrictions. They also come with grants, tax benefits, and potential tourism income, Ethan pointed out. The organic program you've been wanting to expand? This could provide the capital without taking on more debt. Jackson recognized the logic in his son's argument, but something still troubled him. There's the family angle, too. These journals suggest our ancestors were actively involved with Confederate forces, then possibly switched allegiances, and afterward created a completely different story about how we acquired this land. That's a complicated legacy to navigate. It's our history, Dad, Ethan said simply. Complicated or not, isn't it better to know the truth? The question lingered as they walked back to the farmhouse, leaving the researchers to pack up their equipment in the illumination of the floodlights. Inside, Jackson found his kitchen still transformed into an impromptu research station, with documents carefully arranged and catalogued on his dining table. Dr. Abernathy remained, deeply absorbed in one of the journals. He looked up as the Millers entered. "Ah, Mr. Miller, I've been reviewing Lieutenant Wilkes' later entries, and they provide a fascinating insight into the final days of Position Sparrow." Jackson poured himself a cup of coffee, sensing a long night ahead. What happened to the installation? If it was as significant as you suggest, why isn't it in any historical record? That's the truly remarkable aspect, Dr. Abernathy replied, turning to specific pages he had marked. According to these entries, by mid-April 1865, news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox had reached the position, though many refused to accept it as the end of the conflict. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer, was apparently among those determined to continue resistance. The professor indicated a passage, which Jackson read aloud. April 18th, 1865. Dissension grows among the men. Miller's continued detention has divided loyalties, with several local volunteers openly questioning Harrison's authority now that Richmond has fallen. The colonel speaks increasingly of joining Johnston's forces or continuing independent operations from our secured position. But few beyond his personal staff show enthusiasm for prolonging what most now accept is a lost cause. The resistance to surrender was not uncommon, Dr. Abernathy explained. Many Confederate units, particularly those far from the main theaters of war, struggled to accept the reality of defeat. Some commanders considered continuing guerrilla operations or establishing isolated strongholds from which to continue resistance. Ethan had picked up another journal, finding subsequent entries. Listen to this. April 21st, open conflict within the camp. Miller escaped confinement during the night, reportedly aided by Sergeant Davis and 2 others. Harrison has dispatched riders to apprehend them, claiming desertion under fire, though no enemy forces have been observed within 20 miles of our position. Jackson felt a surge of something like pride at the thought of his ancestor defying Confederate authority in the war's final days, though the complex reality was surely more nuanced than these brief entries could convey. And then this, from April 23rd. Ethan continued reading, Disaster. Miller returned with a Union cavalry patrol from the 5th Ohio. Harrison ordered resistance despite being clearly outnumbered. In the ensuing conflict, the magazine was struck, causing significant casualties. I write this from the secondary position, where remaining forces have retreated. Harrison is dead, along with at least 15 others. The Union commander has offered terms which most survivors seem inclined to accept. The room fell silent as they absorbed the implications. Finally, Dr. Abernathy spoke. It appears your ancestor not only escaped Confederate custody, but actively guided Union forces to the position, resulting in its capture. This would explain why no record of the installation appears in Confederate archives. It was overrun before the formal surrender of Johnston's army. And why it doesn't appear in Union records? Jackson asked. That's where things become truly interesting, Dr. Abernathy replied, turning to the final pages of Wilkes's journal. The last entry reads, April 25th, terms finalized with Captain Harrington of the Union forces. In exchange for full parole of all remaining Confederate personnel, all documentation regarding Position Sparrow is to be suppressed, the installation sealed, and its existence kept from official records. Miller's conditions for cooperation include retention of his land claims and absence of any military occupation. The Union captain seems amenable, particularly given reports that Johnston's surrender to Sherman is imminent, rendering our position strategically irrelevant. Jackson struggled to process this revelation. So my ancestor struck a deal. He helps Union forces capture the Confederate position, and in return gets to keep his land and have the whole incident stricken from official records. It appears so, Dr. Abernathy confirmed. And remarkably, that agreement seems to have been honored. No record of any military action in this area appears in either Confederate or Union documentation. Position Sparrow effectively became a ghost installation, forgotten by history but preserved beneath your fields. But why? Ethan asked. Why would both sides agree to essentially erase a military engagement from the record? For the Confederates who surrendered, it offered a way to avoid imprisonment and potential charges of continuing resistance after Lee's surrender, Dr. Abernathy explained. For the Union forces, it simplified their administrative burden during the chaotic final days of the war, and they likely saw little strategic value in documenting the capture of a minor position when major Confederate armies were surrendering elsewhere. And for my ancestor, Jackson pressed, for Samuel Miller it provided a clean slate, Dr. Abernathy suggested. Rather than being documented as someone who first assisted Confederate forces and then betrayed them, potentially making him a target for retribution from either side, he could simply continue as a farmer whose wartime activities remained ambiguous. The explanation made practical sense, yet Jackson found it troubling. His family had built their identity on straightforward narratives of hard work and honest farming, not complex wartime machinations and deliberately obscured histories. As the hour grew late, the remaining researchers took their leave, promising to return in the morning to continue discussions about next steps. Jackson walked Dr. Abernathy to his car, the night air cool against his face after hours in the crowded kitchen. Professor, he said hesitantly, given what we've learned today about my family's actual history with this land, could there be legal implications? Could our ownership be challenged based on these revelations? Dr. Abernathy considered the question thoughtfully. I'm not a legal expert, Mr. Miller, but after 150 years of continuous occupation and clear title, it would be extraordinary for any court to entertain challenges. whatever complicated circumstances surrounded your family's acquisition of this property, time and proper legal documentation have almost certainly solidified your rights. The answer offered some reassurance, though Jackson suspected the full implications of their discoveries were yet to be understood. Returning to the house, he found Ethan still poring over the documents, absorption evident in his expression. "You should get some sleep," Jackson advised. "I suspect tomorrow will be another long day." Ethan nodded absently, then looked up with sudden intensity. "Dad, I've been thinking about the second anomaly the radar detected, the circular chamber separate from the main bunker. What if that contains more than just military supplies?" "You mean the Confederate gold mentioned in the dispatches?" Jackson shook his head skeptically. "That's the stuff of treasure hunter fantasies, not serious historical research. The dispatches specifically mentioned that valuables were moved through this area in late March 1865, Ethan persisted, and Lieutenant Wilkes noted the construction of a secure repository, separate from the main command structure, specifically designed to house sensitive materials and valuables. Jackson sighed, recognizing the gleam of excitement in his son's eyes. Even if such valuables were temporarily stored here, they would have been relocated or discovered during the conflict described in the final journal entries. The Union forces that captured the position would have thoroughly searched the area. "Maybe not," Ethan countered. "If Miller struck a deal with the Union captain to keep the entire encounter off the official record, perhaps part of that arrangement involved misdirection about certain aspects of the installation. The journal mentions that Miller provided conditions for cooperation. What if those conditions included keeping certain information to himself?" The suggestion was troubling, but not implausible. Jackson had spent enough years observing human nature to know that self-interest often shaped decisions, particularly during chaotic times like the war's end. If his ancestor had indeed negotiated terms with Union forces, might he have secured advantages beyond just maintaining his land claim? "That's pure speculation," Jackson cautioned, unwilling to entertain fantasies of hidden Confederate treasure. "Whatever happened here in 1865, our focus needs to be on understanding the historical significance and determining how it affects our farm operations going forward." Nevertheless, as he lay awake that night, Jackson found his thoughts returning to the second anomaly, the separate chamber that didn't match the military construction patterns. What might it contain after 150 years of undisturbed burial beneath his fields? And if valuable artifacts or even precious metals were discovered, what legal and ethical questions would arise regarding ownership and proper historical preservation? Dawn broke with an unusual bustle of activity around the Miller farm. Word of the discovery had evidently spread through academic and historical circles overnight, bringing additional researchers, equipment, and even 2 local news vans that positioned themselves at the edge of the property, denied entry, but clearly intent on covering whatever story was developing. Jackson surveyed this invasion of his normally quiet farm with mixed emotions. The practical farmer in him worried about delayed planting and disrupted operations. The responsible landowner concerned himself with liability issues and proper permissions. But another part, perhaps the same curiosity that had driven his ancestor Samuel Miller, found himself increasingly invested in uncovering the full truth of what lay beneath his fields. Dr. Hargrove arrived early, accompanied by additional officials from the State Historical Preservation Office. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him, "given yesterday's discoveries, we've expedited the paperwork for a formal archaeological assessment. With your permission, we'd like to proceed with limited test excavations to determine the condition of the underground structures. Jackson had made his decision during the sleepless night. "I'll allow the excavation on 2 conditions," he stated firmly. "First, any disruption to my agricultural operations will be fully compensated at market rates. Second, I want complete transparency about anything discovered. No objects removed without my knowledge or consent, and full disclosure about the historical and potential financial implications." Dr. Hargrove seemed relieved by his cooperative stance. "Those are entirely reasonable conditions. We can draw up a formal agreement this morning before any excavation begins." As legal documents were prepared and equipment positioned, Ethan joined his father at the edge of the field, where they watched the methodical preparation of the archaeological team. "They're going to start with a test trench at the edge of the main structure," Ethan explained, clearly having already discussed technical details with the researchers. "The goal is to determine the integrity of the timber supports and assess whether safe entry is possible without risking collapse." Jackson nodded, appreciating his son's enthusiasm while maintaining his own cautious approach. "And the second anomaly? The separate chamber?" "They'll investigate that afterward, depending on what they find in the main structure," Ethan replied. "Dr. Abernathy thinks they're connected by a narrow tunnel, not clearly visible on the radar images." Throughout the morning, the excavation proceeded with meticulous care. Soil was removed in carefully documented layers, each yielding small artifacts that provided glimpses of the site's history: uniform buttons, spent ammunition, broken bottle glass, all catalogued and photographed in situ before removal. By early afternoon, they had reached the roof of the underground structure, revealing hand-hewn timber beams that had survived remarkably well in the clay soil. Structural engineers assessed the stability, determining that with proper reinforcement, safe exploration would be possible. As the excavation expanded, revealing the entrance to what was clearly a sophisticated underground bunker, Jackson found himself increasingly drawn into the historical narrative. This wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. It was his family's hidden past, deliberately buried and forgotten until chance and spring rains had conspired to bring it back to light. "Mr. Miller," called one of the archaeologists, waving him toward the excavation. "We found something you should see." Jackson approached the edge of the trench, where the team had exposed what appeared to be the main entrance to the underground facility. Carved into the lintel above the doorway, still legible after a century and a half, was a name: S. Miller. "Your ancestor," Dr. Abernathy confirmed, joining them at the trench edge. "It appears he was more than just a local farmer enlisted for intelligence. Based on the construction techniques and this dedication, Samuel Miller likely played a significant role in building this facility. The carved name, his name, created a connection across generations that transcended the dry historical accounts." Jackson stared at the letters, weathered but distinct, trying to imagine his ancestors' circumstances and choices during those turbulent final months of the Civil War. "The journals mentioned he had a son who went missing on a scouting mission," Jackson recalled. "Did we ever find out what happened to him?" Dr. Abernathy nodded grimly. "There's a brief reference in Wilkes's April 19th entry. Confirmation received that young Miller was captured near Davidson Creek. Reports indicate he was executed as a spy rather than held as a conventional prisoner, though details remain unverified." The brutal reality of war, suddenly personalized in the fate of a teenage ancestor, made Jackson wince. So Samuel Miller lost his son to the Confederate cause, then turned against them and helped Union forces capture the position. Grief and vengeance are powerful motivators, Dr. Abernathy observed quietly. Throughout history, personal loss has often been the tipping point that transforms someone's allegiances more effectively than any political ideology. As they spoke, the excavation team had begun carefully shoring up the entrance with modern supports, preparing for the first entry into the underground facility. The process was methodical and cautious, with air quality monitors inserted before human exploration would be permitted. "Atmosphere reads normal," called the safety technician after several minutes of testing. "Oxygen levels sufficient, no dangerous. Gas buildup detected, structure appears stable with reinforcement." Dr. Hargrove approached Jackson. "We're ready for initial entry. Given that this is your property and family history, would you like to be among the first to enter?" The invitation surprised him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Whatever academic and historical interests were represented by the assembled experts, this was ultimately his land, his heritage. Jackson glanced at Ethan, whose eager expression made the decision easy. "We'll go together," he told his son. "Let's see what your great-great-great-grandfather built." Equipped with hard hats, lights, and accompanied by 2 archaeological specialists, Jackson and Ethan descended into the excavated entrance. The air was cool and remarkably dry, with the earthy scent of clay and old timber. The passage sloped downward for about 15 feet, before opening into a larger chamber that had clearly served as the command center for Position Sparrow. Time had collapsed portions of the room, but much remained intact and recognizable. A large central table, now partially rotted but still standing, dominated the space. Along the walls, wooden shelving held the deteriorated remains of what had once been maps, documents, and military supplies. In one corner stood a pot-bellied stove, rusted but complete, that would have provided both heat and cooking capabilities for the underground personnel. "Remarkable preservation," breathed one of the archaeologists, carefully photographing each section of the room before anything was disturbed. "This provides an unprecedented glimpse into Confederate field headquarters during the war's final phase." Jackson moved slowly around the perimeter, trying to imagine the space as it would have been in 1865. Officers gathered around the table planning operations, messengers coming and going with dispatches, the stove keeping the underground chamber habitable during late winter chill. Had his ancestor stood in this very room, first as a Confederate collaborator and later as their betrayer? What conversations, arguments, and decisions had occurred within these earthen walls? Ethan had moved to examine what appeared to be a collapsed section of the far wall. "There's another passage here," he called, his light illuminating a narrow opening partially blocked by fallen timbers. The archaeological team carefully assessed the stability before clearing enough debris to reveal that the passage continued deeper into the earth, apparently connecting to another chamber. Air quality tests were repeated before they proceeded, confirming safe conditions despite the narrower confines. "This must lead to the second anomaly detected on the radar," Dr. Hargrove suggested, joining them at the newly discovered passage. "The separate repository mentioned in the documentation. The tunnel extended approximately 20 feet, requiring them to proceed in single file before opening into a smaller circular chamber roughly 8 feet in diameter. Unlike the main room, this space showed signs of more deliberate construction, with fired brick lining the walls rather than timber supports. A significant investment of materials and labor, suggesting its contents had been considered particularly valuable. In the center of the chamber stood a large iron box, approximately 4 feet square, with a sophisticated locking mechanism that had seized with rust over the intervening decades. The box bore no identifying marks beyond a simple set of initials, stamped into the metal: CSA-QM. Confederate States Army Quartermaster, translated the archaeologist, carefully examining the box without touching the fragile lock. This appears to be an official military strongbox, designed for transporting valuables. The implication hung in the air, unspoken, but evident in everyone's expressions. Ethan was the first to voice it directly. Could this actually contain part of the Confederate treasury mentioned in the dispatches? He asked, his voice reverent in the underground chamber. It's certainly consistent with secure storage protocols for military valuables, Dr. Hargrove acknowledged. And its presence in this secondary chamber, separate from the main command center, suggests whatever it contains was considered particularly sensitive or valuable. Jackson stared at the iron box, its surface corroded but intact after 150 years. Buried beneath his fields, if it indeed contained Confederate gold or other valuables, the legal, ethical, and historical questions would be complex. Technically, anything found on his property belonged to him under North Carolina law, but the historical significance would bring intense scrutiny and potential claims from various interests. "How do we proceed?" he asked, looking to Dr. Hargrove. "And the archaeological team?" Dr. Hargrove considered Jackson's question about the iron box with professional caution. The proper archaeological approach would be to document everything thoroughly in situ before attempting to open the container. We'll need specialized conservation equipment to ensure nothing is damaged in the process. "And if it does contain valuable artifacts?" Jackson pressed, the practical implications impossible to ignore. "Legally, artifacts found on private property generally belong to the landowner," Dr. Hargrove acknowledged, "though items of exceptional historical significance often enter agreements for public preservation and display. If monetary valuables are discovered, the legal framework becomes more complex." The iron box seemed to grow more imposing as they contemplated its contents, a direct physical link to the turbulent final days of the Civil War, and potentially to Jackson's ancestors' complicated role in those events. "We should complete documentation of both chambers before attempting to open the box," suggested the lead archaeologist. "This entire site requires comprehensive mapping and analysis." Jackson nodded in agreement, the farmer's patience asserting itself despite the tantalizing mystery. They withdrew from the underground facility as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Miller farm. Outside, the scene had transformed further. Additional media vehicles had arrived at the property edge, and a small crowd of locals had gathered, drawn by rumors of a significant historical discovery. Ethan surveyed the growing spectacle with a mixture of excitement and concern. "This is getting bigger than we anticipated." "That's an understatement," Jackson replied, noticing several official vehicles with state government plates pulling into his driveway. "Looks like we've got more company." A distinguished man in his 60s emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying document cases. Dr. Hargrove immediately moved to greet him with evident respect. "That's Dr. William Thornton," Ethan explained, recognizing the newcomer. He's the state historian for North Carolina, basically the top authority on state historical matters. Dr. Thornton approached the Millers with a warm but serious demeanor. "Mr. Miller, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but when the reports reached my office this morning, I felt this discovery warranted immediate attention at the highest level." "We're still processing it ourselves," Jackson admitted, shaking the historian's offered hand. "Understandably, discoveries of this magnitude are exceedingly rare, particularly with such direct connections to both military history and family legacy." Dr. Thornton gestured toward the excavation site. "I understand you've located not only a previously undocumented Confederate installation, but potentially valuable artifacts as well." "We've found an iron strongbox in a secondary chamber," Dr. Hargrove confirmed. "Its contents remain unknown, pending proper conservation procedures." Dr. Thornton nodded approvingly at the methodical approach. "Given what we now know, I've been authorized to offer state resources for a comprehensive archaeological assessment. This would include full funding for the excavation, conservation of artifacts, and restoration of your agricultural lands after completion." The offer caught Jackson by surprise, a substantial commitment that recognized the historical significance beyond academic interest. "That's generous," he acknowledged, "but I'm concerned about who controls this process and what happens to whatever we find." "A legitimate concern," Dr. Thornton agreed. "I propose a formal partnership agreement that respects your property rights while ensuring proper historical preservation. You would retain ownership of the site and artifacts, with arrangements for scholarly access and potential public display to be negotiated separately." As the discussion continued, more vehicles arrived. Jackson recognized the county sheriff's cruiser pulling in alongside what appeared to be federal government SUVs. The discovery was clearly drawing attention from multiple agencies, each with their own interests and authorities. "This is spiraling beyond a simple historical find," Jackson observed, watching as the sheriff approached in conversation with two individuals who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. "Mr. Miller," the sheriff greeted him, a man Jackson knew casually from community events. "Got a call from these gentlemen after reports hit the Federal Historical Registry. Apparently, Civil War artifacts of potential national significance fall under certain protocols." The federal agents introduced themselves as representatives of the Department of Interior's Heritage Protection Division, a specialized unit that dealt with significant historical discoveries on private land. Their presence underscored the escalating importance of what had begun as a simple storm cleanup. "We're here in an advisory capacity," the senior agent explained, "to ensure proper procedures are followed and to provide federal resources if needed. Discoveries like this sometimes attract unwanted attention from artifact traffickers and looters." As if to validate this concern, the sheriff nodded toward the growing crowd at the property line. "Already had to turn away 3 vehicles with out-of-state plates carrying metal detection equipment. Word travels fast in treasure hunting circles." The mention of treasure hunters brought Jackson's attention back to the iron box, still sitting, undisturbed in the underground chamber. Whatever it contained, historical documents, military artifacts, or actual valuables, its discovery had transformed his quiet farm into the center of an expanding web of interests, authorities, and potential complications. Dr. Thornton, sensing Jackson's growing concern, offered a steadying perspective. "Mr. Miller, While this situation may seem overwhelming, it's important to remember that everyone here shares a common goal: the proper preservation of a significant historical discovery. Your family's connection to this site makes you not just a property owner, but a crucial stakeholder in how this history is documented and shared. The observation helped reframe the chaotic scene for Jackson. This wasn't just about archaeological procedures or legal jurisdictions. It was about his family's place in a historical narrative much more complex than the simple story that had been passed down through generations. As evening approached, a structured response began to take shape. The State Historical Office established a secure perimeter around the excavation site, with sheriff's deputies providing security. Archaeological teams set up equipment for a systematic assessment that would continue through the coming days. Media representatives were given a controlled briefing area at the farm's edge, where Dr. Abernathy provided carefully measured information about the historical significance without sensationalizing the potential contents of the strongbox. In his kitchen that evening, Jackson sat with Ethan, Dr. Thornton, and the lead federal agent, negotiating a formal agreement that would govern the excavation process, artifact conservation, and eventual disposition of discovered materials. The core principle must be respect for both historical significance and private property rights, Dr. Thornton emphasized. Mr. Miller's cooperation is essential for proper scholarly access, but his authority as landowner must be respected. The federal agent nodded agreement. Our interest is ensuring proper historical preservation and security, not asserting control. However, if items of exceptional national significance are discovered, we would encourage consideration of appropriate institutional preservation. Jackson appreciated the carefully balanced approach. My primary concerns are practical: completing spring planting despite this disruption, ensuring my land isn't permanently damaged, and understanding any legal implications before decisions are made about whatever we find. The discussion continued late into the night, resulting in a comprehensive agreement that protected Jackson's interests while allowing for proper archaeological assessment. By morning, a formal excavation plan had been established, with state funding covering both the historical work and compensation for agricultural disruption. The next 3 days saw methodical exploration of the underground facility. The main chamber yielded a wealth of historical artifacts, military equipment, personal effects of the Confederate officers, even preserved documents that had survived in relatively dry conditions. Each discovery added detail to the emerging narrative of Position Sparrow, confirming its role as a last-ditch defensive installation established as the Confederacy faced imminent defeat. More significantly for Jackson, each artifact provided potential insight into his ancestors' complicated role. Samuel Miller's name appeared on several documents: requisition forms for local supplies, intelligence reports on regional movements, and eventually security orders placing him under restricted status as his loyalty became suspect. On the 4th day, with documentation of both chambers complete, preparations began for the careful opening of the iron strongbox. Conservation specialists had arrived with equipment designed to minimize damage to the fragile lock mechanism, while security around the site had been further enhanced in response to growing public interest. "We're ready to proceed with the opening," Dr. Hargrove informed Jackson and Ethan as they gathered at the excavation entrance. "As the property owner, you have the right to be present, though I must emphasize that conservation protocols will dictate a methodical process rather than a dramatic unveiling. "I wouldn't miss it," Jackson replied, his curiosity about his family's hidden history now thoroughly engaged despite his initial reservations. They descended once more into the underground chambers, now reinforced with modern supports and illuminated by professional archaeological lighting. The circular brick chamber that housed the strongbox had been fully documented, revealing additional details that suggested its special purpose: a drainage system to keep the contents dry, ventilation channels to prevent moisture buildup, and traces of what appeared to be additional security measures long since deteriorated. The conservation team worked with painstaking care, applying specialized lubricants to the rusted lock mechanism and using precision tools to gradually free the seized components without causing damage. After nearly an hour of delicate work, a distinctive click echoed in the chamber as the lock finally yielded. "We've gained access," announced the lead conservator. "Now we'll remove the lid with equal care, as the contents may be fragile or deteriorated after 150 years. Camera equipment was positioned to document every aspect of the opening, creating a permanent record for both historical archives and legal purposes. With glacial slowness, the heavy iron lid was raised, revealing the strongbox's long-hidden contents. Jackson held his breath, half expecting to see the gleam of gold coins or Confederate currency. Instead, the box contained several smaller containers, wooden cases, leather document portfolios, and a single metal cylinder sealed with wax. "Not what treasure hunters would hope for," Ethan observed quietly, "but potentially more valuable from a historical perspective." The conservation team carefully removed each container, documenting its position before preliminary examination. The wooden cases contained military documents, operational orders, encrypted communications, and what appeared to be contingency plans for continuing Confederate resistance after Richmond's fall. The leather portfolios held financial records, including detailed accounting of resources allocated to Position Sparrow and disbursement records for troops. It was the metal cylinder that ultimately commanded the most attention. Approximately 18 inches long and 4 inches in diameter, it bore the official seal of the Confederate War Department, remarkably preserved in the wax coating that had protected its contents from environmental damage. "This would have been used for the most sensitive communications," Dr. Abernathy explained, examining the cylinder without breaking the seal. "The wax protection suggests these were considered documents of exceptional importance. Following strict conservation protocols, the cylinder was carefully transported to a specialized workstation established in one of the equipment tents on the surface. There, under controlled conditions, and with Jackson and Ethan present as witnesses, the wax seal was delicately broken and the contents extracted. Inside lay a rolled set of documents on high-quality paper that had survived remarkably well within the protective cylinder. As they were carefully unrolled and secured for viewing, the assembled experts fell into stunned silence at what was revealed. "These are executive orders signed by Jefferson Davis himself," Dr. Thornton finally stated, his voice hushed with academic awe. "Dated April 2, 1865, after Richmond had fallen but before the formal surrenders. They outline the establishment of secondary command centers and the dispersal of Confederate Treasury assets to fund continued resistance." The documents provided explicit confirmation of what had previously been historical speculation. plans for a continuation of Confederate governance and military operations despite the loss of their capital and primary armies. More remarkably, they included detailed inventories of treasury disbursements with specific allocations to various commands, including Position Sparrow. According to this manifest, Dr. Abernathy noted, studying one document closely, Position Sparrow was allocated 3 cases of gold specie and 5 of silver, with instructions to secure these resources for sustained operations independent of central command structures. Jackson processed this information slowly. So Confederate gold was indeed sent here, but it's not in the strongbox. No, agreed Dr. Thornton, which raises the obvious question. What happened to it? The answer emerged as they continued examining the documents. A handwritten addendum, dated April 22, 1865, the day after the confrontation described in Lieutenant Wilkes's journal, bore the signature of a Union Captain James Harrington of the 5th Ohio Cavalry. Upon negotiated surrender of Confederate forces at Position Sparrow, the document stated, all materials and valuables designated for military purposes are hereby confiscated under standard protocols of war. In recognition of intelligence provided by local citizen Samuel Miller, which facilitated peaceful resolution with minimal casualties, certain considerations are hereby granted, including 1. Parole of all surrendering Confederate personnel. 2. Recognition of existing land claims by the Miller family. 3. Omission of this action from official military records to prevent retribution against cooperative local citizens. Dr. Thornton looked up from the document with profound interest. This confirms the extraordinary arrangement suggested in the journals, a negotiated surrender with deliberate omission from official records. Essentially, your ancestor struck a deal that protected him from retribution by either side while securing his family's claim to this land. But it doesn't mention what happened to the gold and silver, Ethan pointed out. Actually, it does. Indirectly, Dr. Abernathy responded, indicating a line on the manifest that had been annotated in different handwriting. This notation indicates all valuable materials confiscated per standard protocols. The Union forces took possession of whatever Confederate Treasury assets had been stored here. The revelation was simultaneously clarifying and disappointing. There was no hidden Confederate gold still buried on the Miller farm. It had been confiscated by Union forces over 150 years ago, then deliberately omitted from official records as part of the negotiated surrender. Yet as Jackson continued examining the documents, a different kind of treasure emerged. The authentic story of his ancestors' complicated journey through the Civil War's final days. Samuel Miller had initially cooperated with Confederate forces, then lost his son to their cause, and finally facilitated their surrender to Union troops under terms that protected both his neighbors and his family's future. He made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances, Jackson reflected, studying his ancestors' signature on several of the documents, then created a simplified story about acquiring the land after the war, probably to protect his family from those who might have viewed his actions as betrayal. Many families simplified or revised their Civil War histories in the aftermath, Dr. Thornton observed. The reality of divided loyalties and complex choices was often too painful or dangerous to acknowledge openly, particularly in border regions where neighbors had fought on opposite sides. The absence of Confederate gold didn't diminish media interest in the discovery. The authenticated documents, particularly those bearing Jefferson Davis's signature outlining last-ditch resistance plans, represented a historical find of national significance. The underground facility itself, remarkably preserved after 150 years, provided unprecedented insights into Confederate field operations during the war's final phase. Over the following weeks, the Miller farm became the center of a carefully managed archaeological project. The State Historical Office, true to their agreement, provided both funding for the excavation and compensation for the disrupted agricultural operations. Jackson and Ethan worked with experts to develop a plan that would allow for both historical preservation and continued farming operations on the surrounding land. "We could establish a small interpretation center near the barn," suggested the historical preservation architect who had joined the project. The underground chambers could be properly stabilized and made accessible for limited scholarly research, while the main farm operations continue unaffected. The prospect of transforming a portion of his property into a historical site initially gave Jackson pause, but Ethan's enthusiasm proved persuasive. "It's an opportunity to diversify the farm's income while preserving something truly significant," his son argued. "We're not just farmers, Dad. We're caretakers of history that happens to include our own family's story." That perspective resonated with Jackson more deeply than he had expected. For generations, the Millers had viewed themselves simply as agriculturalists, working the land with practical focus on seasons and harvests. The discovery had revealed a more complex legacy, one that included difficult choices, moral ambiguities, and a direct connection to pivotal historical events. As spring planting finally resumed on the unexcavated portions of the farm, Jackson found himself thinking differently about the land beneath his tractor. The fields he had worked his entire life had witnessed more than agricultural cycles. They had seen the desperate final maneuvers of a dying Confederacy, the grief of a father whose son was lost to war, and the pragmatic negotiations that had allowed his family to remain when peace finally came. One evening, as sunset painted the western ridge in gold, the same ridge where Confederate artillery had once been positioned, Jackson and Ethan sat on the farmhouse porch, reviewing proposed designs for the small historical center that would commemorate Position Sparrow. "They want to name it the Samuel Miller Historical Site," Ethan noted, showing his father the preliminary signage concepts. "Your ancestor is now officially the central figure in this narrative." Jackson studied the proposed text, which presented a nuanced account of Samuel Miller's complicated journey through the war's final days. Not quite the straightforward story Granddad told about our family history. "No," Ethan agreed, "but it's more compelling and probably more helpful for visitors trying to understand how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances." "You think people will actually come to learn about this?" Jackson asked, still adjusting to the idea of visitors purposely coming to his remote farm. "Dad, this is the only known example of a ghost Confederate installation with intact underground structures and documented connection to the final dispersal of treasury assets. History buffs will absolutely make the pilgrimage." Ethan's expression grew more thoughtful. "But more importantly, it's a story about how someone caught between impossible choices found a path that protected his family and community while acknowledging changing realities. That's timeless." The observation struck Jackson as profound. His ancestor hadn't been simply a Confederate sympathizer or a Union collaborator. He had been a father and farmer, navigating chaotic circumstances while trying to secure his family's future. The simplified narrative that had been passed down through generations had obscured the moral complexity that made the true story so much more human and relatable. Dr. Thornton joined them on the porch, having returned to discuss the final conservation of the discovered documents. "You know," he observed following their conversation, "what makes this discovery truly special isn't just its historical rarity, it's the personal connection to decision points that shaped a family's trajectory for generations. My ancestor created a convenient fiction about how we acquired this land," Jackson noted. "Is it wrong that I find myself understanding why?" "Not at all," Dr. Thornton replied. "Historical judgment requires understanding context. Samuel Miller made pragmatic choices in chaotic circumstances that allowed your family to survive the war's aftermath and build a continuing legacy. The simplified story he created wasn't just self-protection. It was forward-looking, focusing on building rather than dwelling on painful divisions." As darkness settled over the farm, Jackson considered how the unexpected discovery had transformed not just his understanding of his family's past, but potentially its future as well. The planned historical site would create a new dimension to the Miller farm, one that honored agricultural traditions while acknowledging a more complex historical legacy. "You know what I keep thinking about," Jackson said after a comfortable silence. "That carved name we found on the bunker entrance, S. Miller. My ancestor literally left his mark on this land, not knowing if anyone would ever see it again. Now, 150 years later, it's not just seen but understood in ways he probably never imagined." "That's how legacy works," Dr. Thornton observed. "We leave marks, both intentional and unintentional, without knowing how future generations will interpret them. The lucky ones have descendants willing to do the hard work of understanding rather than simply judging." The conversation continued into the evening, ranging from specific archaeological details to broader questions about how communities remember complicated histories. Throughout, Jackson found himself increasingly comfortable with the dual identity, emerging for the Miller farm, both a working agricultural operation with generations of continuity and a site of historical significance where Americans had navigated the war's complex moral landscape. Later, after Dr. Thornton had departed and Ethan had retired for the night, Jackson returned to the kitchen table where the most personally significant artifact from the excavation now rested. Unlike the official documents and military artifacts that would eventually be curated in the historical center, this item would remain with the family, a simple pocket watch recovered from the main chamber of the underground facility, engraved with the initials SM, and containing a small daguerreotype of a young man in civilian clothes. The watch had stopped at 10:17, perhaps marking the moment of some significant event during those turbulent April days in 1865. The image inside, presumably Jackson's great-great-granduncle, who had gone missing on a Confederate scouting mission, provided a human face to the historical drama that had unfolded beneath the Miller fields. Holding this direct connection to his ancestors, Jackson reflected on how the accidental discovery had enriched rather than diminished his connection to the land. The farm was not just soil and crops, buildings and equipment. It was a continuing story of adaptation and perseverance through changing circumstances. Samuel Miller had navigated the Civil War's moral complexities and secured a future for his descendants. Subsequent generations had weathered agricultural transformations, economic challenges, and changing markets. Now it was Jackson's turn to adapt, incorporating this newfound historical dimension into the farm's identity while maintaining its agricultural heart. The challenge seemed less daunting than it had just weeks earlier, perhaps because understanding his ancestors' complex choices had revealed a capacity for pragmatic flexibility in the Miller bloodline that transcended generations. The watch rested heavily in his palm, a physical connection across time to the man whose decisions had shaped his family's path without his knowing. Tomorrow would bring more archaeological teams, more media inquiries, more planning for the historical site. But tonight, in the quiet farmhouse, Jackson simply acknowledged the unexpected kinship he felt with Samuel Miller, another farmer who had found himself caught in extraordinary circumstances, making the best choices he could for those who would come after him. Autumn painted the Miller farm in rich amber and gold, transforming the landscape from the vibrant greens of summer to the deeper hues of harvest. 6 months had passed since the storm that collapsed the old barn and unleashed a hidden chapter of history. Now, on this crisp October morning, Jackson stood at the edge of his eastern field, watching the combines harvest the season's soybean crop, while construction crews put the finishing touches on what had become known locally as the Miller Heritage Center. The contrast between the agricultural and historical activities represented the new balance the farm had struck, honoring the past while continuing the productive traditions that had sustained the family for generations. The Heritage Center, a modest but elegant structure built where the old barn had once stood, had been designed to complement the farm's rural character while providing proper facilities for displaying artifacts and welcoming visitors. Final inspection is scheduled for tomorrow, called Ethan, approaching with architectural plans tucked under his arm. His summer break from university had extended into a full semester off, his academic focus shifting to combine agricultural studies with historical preservation, a unique interdisciplinary approach inspired by their discovery. "They've done good work," Jackson acknowledged, appreciating how the new building echoed traditional barn architecture while incorporating modern museum standards. "Your mother would have approved of the design." The mention of his late wife, who had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier, came more easily now. Something about reconnecting with the family's deeper history had made Jackson more comfortable acknowledging all aspects of its continuity, including loss. "She always said this place had stories to tell," Ethan recalled with a smile. "Though I doubt even she imagined anything this dramatic." Together, they walked toward the Heritage Center, where the excavated entrance to the underground Confederate facility had been carefully preserved and secured with a viewing platform that allowed visitors to see into the main chamber without risking damage to the historical structures. The more significant artifacts, including the Jefferson Davis documents and Lieutenant Wilkes's journals, were displayed in custom-built conservation cases with climate control and specialized lighting. Dr. Eleanor Hargrove emerged from the building, clipboard in hand, as she conducted her own pre-inspection assessment. Over the months, she had become not just a professional partner in the historical project, but something of a friend to the Miller family. Her genuine interest in preserving both the archaeological significance and the farm's continuing viability, creating common ground. "The exhibition looks wonderful," she greeted them. "The State Historical Commission representatives will be impressed by how much you've accomplished in such a short time." "We had good advisors," Jackson acknowledged. "A motivation beyond just historical interest. Indeed, the development of the Heritage Center had coincided with a challenging agricultural season. Drought had stressed crops across the region, and commodity prices had fluctuated unpredictably. The diversification of income through the historical site had provided financial breathing room that many neighboring farms lacked. "The advance ticket reservations for the opening weekend are already at capacity," Dr. Hargrove noted, consulting her tablet. "There's significant interest from both academic circles and the general public." What had begun as an archaeological curiosity had evolved into something more substantial, a carefully managed historical attraction that would provide sustainable, supplementary income while keeping the working farm at the center of the Miller family identity. The State Historical Office had helped navigate the complex process of obtaining National Historic Landmark designation, which brought both prestige and practical benefits through preservation grants and tax considerations. Inside the Heritage Center, final preparations continued for the official opening scheduled for the following weekend. Museum-quality displays told the story of Position Sparrow, the last-ditch Confederate installation established as the war's outcome became increasingly clear. Interactive exhibits explained the strategic context, the agricultural significance of the region, and the complex loyalties that had divided communities during the conflict. But the element that had drawn the most scholarly attention was the central exhibit dedicated to Samuel Miller himself, not just as a historical footnote, but as the human center of a complex moral narrative. Using excerpts from the discovered documents, the exhibit explored his journey from initial cooperation with Confederate forces through the loss of his son and his eventual decision to facilitate Union capture of the position. The visitor surveys consistently show this as the most compelling part of the experience, noted the museum designer who had helped develop the exhibit. People connect with Samuel's impossible choices in ways that make the broader historical context more accessible. Jackson studied the display that presented his ancestor's story, still adjusting to seeing his family history interpreted for public consumption. The narrative neither glorified nor vilified Samuel Miller's actions, but presented them as the complicated negotiations of a father and farmer caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to protect his family, his land, and eventually his community as the war's conclusion rendered continued resistance not just futile but destructive. "You've created something remarkable here," came a voice from behind them. Dr. William Thornton, the state historian who had been instrumental in securing resources for the project, had arrived for a preliminary review before the official opening. Most historical sites either simplify morally complex situations or avoid them entirely. This directly engages with the messy reality of how ordinary people navigated extraordinary times. "That was important to us," Jackson acknowledged. "I didn't want a sanitized version that either vilified or heroized my ancestor. He was a farmer, making difficult decisions to protect what mattered to him." "Which is precisely why visitors will connect with this story," Dr. Thornton observed. "Most Americans understand their own family histories contain similar complexities. Choices made under pressure, perspectives that evolved with changing circumstances, narratives simplified over time to create cleaner legacies." As they toured the completed facility, Jackson was struck by how the project had transformed not just his property, but his understanding of his place within his family's continuum. 6 months ago, he had defined himself simply as the latest in a line of miller farmers, working the land as generations had before him. Now he recognized a deeper legacy, an inherited pragmatism and adaptability that had allowed the family to navigate not just seasonal challenges, but historical inflection points. The most powerful realization had come gradually, the difficult choice to incorporate this historical dimension into the farm's identity paralleled Samuel Miller's own pivotal decision in 1865. Both had required setting aside established patterns and embracing new realities to secure a viable future. Jackson had initially resisted the disruption to his farming operations and the public attention. His ancestor had similarly struggled with shifting allegiances as the war's outcome became clear. Both had ultimately chosen adaptation over rigid adherence to previous patterns. This connection across generations had transformed Jackson's perspective on what maintaining family legacy truly meant. It wasn't about rigid preservation of unchanging traditions, but about the continuing capacity to adapt while maintaining core values and connection to the land. Outside the Heritage Center, a small monument had been erected, not an imposing statue, but a simple stone marker that acknowledged the complicated history of Position Sparrow while honoring both the Confederate soldiers who had built the installation and Samuel Miller's eventual choice to facilitate its peaceful surrender. The careful wording had been developed through consultation with historical experts, community representatives, and the Miller family itself, aiming to reflect historical accuracy without political distortion. That's about as balanced as possible, given the subject matter, observed Dr. Abernathy, who had joined them for the pre-opening inspection. Civil War commemorations are inevitably challenging, but focusing on the human elements rather than ideological abstractions makes it more authentic. The marker's modest design embodied the approach Jackson had insisted upon throughout the development: acknowledgement without glorification, historical accuracy without political agenda, and a focus on the human dimensions that transcended the conflict's divisive legacy. It represented a middle path through the increasingly polarized interpretations of Civil War history that had characterized recent years. As evening approached, the various experts and professionals departed, leaving Jackson and Ethan to walk the property alone. They followed the newly established pathway that connected the Heritage Center to the still working portions of the farm, a physical representation of the balanced approach they had developed. "I've been thinking about what happens after I graduate," Ethan said as they reached the equipment barn where modern agricultural machinery stood ready for the next day's harvesting. "I want to come back to the farm full-time, but with a focus on developing both aspects of what we're building here." The statement caught Jackson by surprise. Before the discovery, Ethan had shown interest in agricultural science, but had seemed destined for a career beyond the family farm, perhaps in research or agricultural technology. The prospect of his son choosing to return and continue the Miller legacy, albeit in an evolved form, was unexpected but deeply gratifying. "You're sure about that?" Jackson asked, careful not to reveal too much enthusiasm until he understood his son's thinking. Farming's never been an easy life, and managing a historical site alongside it won't make it simpler. "I'm sure," Ethan confirmed, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the land that had been in his family for generations. What we've created here is unique, not just another struggling family farm, not just another historical attraction, but something that honors both aspects of our legacy. I want to build on that. The conversation continued as they walked back toward the farmhouse, discussing practical considerations, potential innovations, and longer-term visions for both the agricultural operations and the historical center. As they talked, Jackson recognized that the unexpected discovery had not only revealed a hidden chapter of his family's past, but had potentially secured its future by creating a path that engaged his son's intellectual interests while maintaining connection to the land itself. Later that evening, after Ethan had departed for a meeting with university advisors to discuss his revised academic plans, Jackson sat alone on the farmhouse porch. The Heritage Center was illuminated by security lighting that highlighted its architectural features against the darkening sky, while the distant hum of the grain dryers processing the day's harvest provided a counterpoint that represented the farm's continuing agricultural identity. Dr. Hargrove's SUV appeared on the winding driveway, making one final visit before departing for Raleigh. Jackson had come to appreciate her balanced approach to the project, her academic expertise tempered by practical respect for the farm's continuing operations and the family's personal connection to the discoveries. I wanted to drop off the final visitor guides before heading back, she explained, joining him on the porch with a box of professionally designed brochures. The printers finished them earlier than expected. Jackson examined one of the glossy trifolds, which featured a tasteful design that integrated historical imagery with photography of the modern farm. Position Sparrow, a Civil War legacy at Miller Farm, read the title, with Samuel Miller's daguerreotype from the pocket watch featured prominently. "This looks excellent," he acknowledged. "You've managed to capture the complexity without sensationalizing it." "That was the goal," Dr. Hargrove agreed, settling into one of the rocking chairs that had graced the Miller farmhouse porch for decades. Too many historical attractions either oversimplify or exaggerate. The power of this site is in its authenticity, a real family navigating extraordinary circumstances, making difficult choices that reverberated through generations. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the autumn evening wrapping around them with its characteristic blend of lingering warmth and approaching chill. The seasonal transition seemed fitting for the farm's current state, honoring summers, harvest while preparing for new growth after necessary dormancy. "You know," Dr. Hargrove said thoughtfully, "when I first arrived here the morning after your discovery, I never anticipated how this project would evolve. Most landowners in your position would have either rejected the disruption entirely or pushed for the most profitable development possible. Your approach has been uniquely balanced." "I'm just a farmer," Jackson replied modestly. "We understand that sometimes you have to adapt to changing conditions while preserving what matters most. That's precisely the insight that makes this historical center so compelling," she observed. "Your ancestor made a similar calculation in 1865, recognizing when circumstances had changed irreversibly and finding a path that preserved what was most essential while accepting new realities." The parallel hadn't escaped Jackson's notice. During the months of excavation and development, he had come to feel an unexpected kinship with the great-great-grandfather he had never known. Both had faced disruptive changes to established patterns. Both had needed to reconcile practical considerations with deeper values, and both had ultimately chosen adaptability over rigid adherence to previous assumptions. The most remarkable aspect, Dr. Hargrove continued, is how your family maintained its essential connection to this land through dramatically changing circumstances. From Civil War chaos through Reconstruction, the agricultural transformations of the 20th century, and now this new chapter, the Miller farm endures because each generation found ways to adapt without abandoning its core identity. The observation resonated deeply with Jackson. Throughout the archaeological process and subsequent development, he had worried about betraying agricultural traditions by embracing the historical dimension. Now he recognized that the true betrayal would have been failing to adapt in ways that ensured the farm's continuing viability. What you've created here isn't just historically significant, Dr. Hargrove added. It's a model for how rural communities might navigate the increasingly challenging economics of family farming. By honoring history alongside agricultural production, you've created a more resilient and sustainable operation than either would be independently. Indeed, the financial projections supported this assessment, while neighboring farms struggled. With the economic pressures of corporate agriculture and climate uncertainty, the Miller farm had secured diversified income streams that would help weather market fluctuations while maintaining its working agricultural identity. Ethan wants to come back after graduation, Jackson shared, still processing this unexpected development. He's talking about agricultural tourism initiatives that would connect the historical center with demonstrations of both traditional and innovative farming practices. That's extraordinary, Dr. Hargrove responded, genuine pleasure evident in her voice. The most endangered element of American agricultural heritage isn't the physical artifacts, but the intergenerational continuity, the passing of land and knowledge from one generation to the next. If your discovery has helped secure that continuity, it's perhaps the most valuable preservation achievement possible. Later, after Dr. Hargrove had departed and darkness had fully settled over the farm, Jackson returned to the small home office where he kept the family records. Among the practical documentation of seed purchases, equipment maintenance, and crop yields, he had recently established a new archive, copies of the historical materials discovered beneath his fields, alongside the continuing documentation of how the farm was evolving in response. At the center of this collection sat Samuel Miller's pocket watch, restored to working condition by a specialized conservator, but maintained as a family keepsake rather than a museum piece. Jackson wound it carefully, the ritual connecting him physically to the ancestor whose choices had shaped his family's trajectory in ways that had remained hidden for generations. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, a mechanical heartbeat that had resumed after 150 years of silence. In its renewed rhythm, Jackson felt both connection to the past and orientation toward the future, the timepiece embodying the continuous thread that linked his ancestors' difficult choices with his own recent decisions and the possibilities his son would eventually navigate. The official opening of the Heritage Center was scheduled for Saturday, with state officials, historical scholars, and community members expected to attend. Jackson had initially dreaded the public attention, uncomfortable with cameras and speeches. Now, however, he recognized the event as not just a historical commemoration, but a celebration of continuity, the Miller farm beginning its next chapter while honoring all that had come before. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the final day of soybean harvest. Jackson rose before sunrise, as generations of farmers had before him, and moved through the familiar routine of equipment checks and operational planning. The rhythms of agriculture continued alongside the historical preparations, neither diminishing the other, but instead creating a richer whole. From the cab of his combine, harvesting the eastern field with practiced efficiency, Jackson could see the Heritage Center where final preparations for the weekend opening were underway. The juxtaposition no longer seemed discordant but harmonious, different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to the land and its legacy. At midday, he paused the harvest to meet with Dr. Thornton and representatives from the state Historical Commission, who had arrived for the final inspection before the official opening. Their approval was largely ceremonial at this point, the substantial work having been completed and reviewed throughout the development process, but it represented formal recognition of what the Miller farm had become, both a working agricultural operation and a site of significant historical preservation. "You've achieved something remarkable here," the commission chairwoman commented as they completed the inspection tour. Most historical sites struggle to convey authentic connection to their original purpose. This remains a living, working farm that incorporates historical significance without becoming a static museum. "That was always our intention," Jackson acknowledged. "The history matters because it's part of a continuing story, not because it freezes one moment in time." The final element of the Heritage Center had been completed just days earlier, a small theater space where visitors could watch a documentary. A film that positioned Sparrow and the Miller family in historical context. Jackson had initially resisted participating in the filming, uncomfortable with public speaking and concerned about appearing on camera. Eventually, however, he had recognized the importance of including the current generation's perspective alongside the historical documentation. Now, as the commission representatives previewed the completed film, Jackson watched his own recorded interview with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. On screen, seated in the wooden rocking chair that had graced the farmhouse porch for decades, he spoke about what the discovery had meant for his understanding of his family's legacy. "Farming is fundamentally about continuity," his recorded self explained. "Each season connects to the ones before and after. Each generation builds on the work of those who came before, while preparing for those who will follow. What we discovered beneath our fields wasn't separate from that continuity. It was part of it, a chapter that had been buried but remained connected to everything that came afterward." The documentary continued, interspersing historical context with personal reflections, expert analysis with the practical realities of maintaining a working farm. It concluded with footage of Jackson and Ethan walking the property at sunset, the visual metaphor of generational transition made explicit without heavy-handed narration. As the lights came up after the screening, the commission representatives offered enthusiastic approval. "This captures exactly what makes this site unique," the chairwoman observed. "The historical elements matter not just for academic understanding, but because they inform a continuing legacy." Later that evening, Jackson stood at the entrance to the Heritage Center, everything now prepared for the next day's official opening. The building was illuminated from within, the artifacts and exhibits visible through large windows, designed to make the historical elements accessible even when the facility wasn't open for tours. Outside, subtle lighting highlighted the architectural features, while solar-powered lamps marked the pathway that connected the center to the still active agricultural operations. The contrast between this carefully developed historical attraction and the simple farm that had existed 6 months earlier was striking. Yet for all the physical changes, what moved Jackson most was the internal transformation, his evolving understanding of what it meant to maintain family legacy in changing circumstances. His ancestor Samuel Miller had faced the collapse of an established order and made difficult choices to secure his family's future. Jackson had confronted different challenges, but navigated a similar fundamental question: how to honor inherited values while adapting to new realities. Both had found paths forward that maintained essential connections while embracing necessary changes. As Jackson walked back toward the farmhouse in the gathering darkness, the Heritage Center glowing behind him and the equipment barns looming ahead, he felt a profound sense of rightness about the balance they had struck. The Miller farm would continue as it had for generations, growing crops, weathering seasons, participating in the fundamental cycles of agricultural life. But it would also honor the hidden history that had shaped its journey, acknowledging complexities that previous generations had chosen to bury beneath simplified narratives. In this integration of past and present, historical significance, and continuing productivity, Jackson recognized a deeper truth about legacy than he had understood before. It wasn't about rigid preservation of unchanging practices, but about maintaining core connections while adapting to evolving circumstances. Samuel Miller had secured his family's future not by clinging to Confederate allegiance as defeat became inevitable, but by recognizing changing realities and finding a path that preserved what mattered most: his family's connection to the land itself. Now, 7 generations later, Jackson had made a parallel choice, embracing the historical dimension not as a replacement for agricultural identity, but as a complementary element that strengthened the farm's viability for future generations. The Miller legacy continued, not despite this adaptation, but because of it. The capacity for thoughtful evolution itself, a cherished inheritance passed from one generation to the next. In the farmhouse that evening, Jackson added a final entry to the journal he had begun keeping since the discovery. Unlike the practical logs of weather patterns and crop yields that had characterized his previous record-keeping, this journal captured reflections on legacy, adaptation, and continuity. "Tomorrow, we officially open the Heritage Center," he wrote, 150 years after Samuel Miller made choices that shaped everything that followed. The visitors will see artifacts and read historical accounts, but what matters most is the story that connects his decisions to our current reality, the continuing thread that runs through generations of Millers who found ways to maintain their connection to this land through changing circumstances. What began with a collapsed barn and a hidden crate has become something I couldn't have imagined. Not just the excavation of a forgotten Confederate installation, but the uncovering of a deeper understanding of what family legacy truly means. Samuel Miller's pocket watch ticks again on my desk, measuring not just hours and minutes, but the continuing heartbeat of a farm that has sustained my family through war and peace, prosperity and hardship, simplicity and complexity. Ethan will return after graduation to continue what Samuel began and I have maintained, The crops will still grow, the seasons will still turn, but our understanding of our place within them has been enriched by what we found beneath the surface. Not Confederate gold, but something more valuable. The knowledge that adaptation and continuity are not opposing forces, but essential partners in maintaining what matters most. As Jackson closed the journal, the pocket watch ticking softly beside it, he felt a profound connection to all the Miller farmers who had worked this land before him and those who would follow. The unexpected discovery had not diminished this agricultural legacy, but deepened it, revealing dimensions of resilience and adaptability that transcended specific historical circumstances. When Thomas Caldwell's plow struck an unexpected metal hatch, he had uncovered a forgotten piece of history that transformed his understanding of his quiet Pennsylvania farm. When Jackson Miller's tractor blade caught on a hidden wooden crate, he had similarly found himself confronting buried truths that changed his perspective on his family's legacy. Both discoveries revealed that beneath the surface of ordinary rural life lay extraordinary stories waiting to be uncovered, not just artifacts and documents, but deeper truths about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary times, making choices that echo through generations, even when the specific circumstances are forgotten or deliberately obscured. In that shared revelation across different stories and circumstances lay a universal truth. Our connection to the past is never as simple as the narratives we inherit, and our responsibility to the future requires both honoring those who came before and making our own difficult choices about what to preserve and what to transform. The true legacy of the Miller farm, like all meaningful inheritances, lay not in unchanging tradition, but in the continuing capacity to adapt while maintaining essential connections to the land, to family, and to the complex moral journey that links one generation to the next. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.